In this video, we'll start to look at the events that can be defined on the screens in customer-facing applications, in particular on web screens. Also, we'll describe some characteristics of the panel object. This type of application includes two types of events: events that are triggered on the client side and events that are triggered on the server. The server events are the same ones we already saw when we studied web panels: the start, refresh, and load events, which allow us to interact with the database. The client-side events are client start, back, user-defined events, and events associated with the screen controls. When we use the panel objects to generate an application for mobile devices, we'll also have other events associated with the mobile platform. For example, related to the type of device and its orientation when the application is executed. Now we'll see server-side events. The first one executed is the start event. It's executed only once, when the panel is opened, and will not be executed again unless we leave the object and reopen it. The refresh event is executed after the start event, usually only once, but it can be invoked again using the refresh command. In that case, it'll be executed more than once, and it will be the first event, since start will not be executed again. When the refresh event is invoked, the load event will be triggered at the end. This will only happen if there is at least one grid in the panel and the grid is not a collection SDT variable. The load event is the last of the system events to be executed. And, if it has a base table, it'll be executed as many times as records exist in the base table. If the grid doesn't have a base table, it'll be executed only once. And if the grid is based on an SDT, the load event will not be executed. In the example of the previous video, when we implemented the attractions cfpanel panel object, we programmed the events start, refresh, and load. In the load event, we calculated the total trips of an attraction by means of a formula that accessed the trip attraction table. In the refresh event, we programmed a for each command to access the trip attraction table to count the overall total of trips of the attractions. We also programmed the start event to initialize the details variable with the text we wanted to appear on the screen. Client-side events are the application's response to user interaction. There are three types of client events: system, user and control events. The system events are client start and back, which we will not see in this course. User events are those created by the user, and control events are those associated with the screen controls, such as tap, double tap, or control value changed events, among others. The code associated with these events is executed on the client, unless access to a server service is required. For example, if you want to access the database. During the execution of a client-side event, server-side events are not executed unless explicitly required through the refresh command. These client-side events will have a particular grammar that's different from the server-side events. In the same object we saw before, we program only events associated with the controls. We don't program any user events. To each variable of the on-screen filters, we program its control value changed event to trigger the grid refresh method, which will cause the server refresh and load events to be triggered to update the contents of the grid with the filters entered. We also programmed the tap event of the details variable to invoke the attraction detail cfpanel to see the details of the selected attraction, whose attraction ID identifier is sent in a parameter. Let's now look at the grammar of client-side events. For client-side events, there are restrictions regarding the commands that can be used, but not for server-side events. As for commands, the accepted ones are shown here. We won't go into more detail in this course. The composite command is used in client-side events in panel objects, when 2 or more lines have to be written in an event, and in this case, it is mandatory to group the entire code of the event within this command. This command is important because if an error occurs in the call sequence, it stops running, and the errors are automatically handled and displayed on the screen with no need to implement any programming. This is a great difference with web panels, because when a called object in an event causes an error, the execution is not interrupted. It continues in the following statement, and the developer is responsible for handling the errors and programming the actions to be taken. Now let's look at some characteristics of the panel object. As we mentioned before, in the panel objects, we can identify 2 different parts. The first part is called the fixed or flat part that contains everything in the form that's not included in any grid. In the example we see on screen, the fixed part is made up of the filter variables country ID, attraction name from, attraction name to, and the total trips. The second part will be called grid or variable part, and in this case, it'll be made up of the grid that contains the attraction's data. We'll always have a fixed part, and we can have a variable part for each of the grids of the panel. For each part, fixed and grid, GeneXus will automatically generate data providers that will be published as services on the server and will resolve data access. We will not see these data providers in the knowledge base because GeneXus will generate and maintain them, but we will be able to see the data accessed by each one if we see their navigation list, as we did before. Now let's see what happens when we run a panel object. First, the client start event is executed only once and runs on the client as we saw before. Next, a data provider is executed that will return the necessary data to load the fixed part of the panel. This data provider is part of the execution of the code of the start and refresh events that will be executed on the server. Also, it returns the information to load the fixed part in a single result. Afterwards, the fixed part of the panel is drawn. A second data provider will be executed to retrieve the data required by the grid. Within the execution of this data provider, the load event code is executed on the server. This load event will be executed n times when the grid has a base table, once for each record, and only once if the grid doesn't have a base table. At the end of the execution of the data provider, it'll return the information generated by all these executions of the load event in a single result, with which the grid will be loaded, and then the grid will be drawn completely. The fact that the screen is drawn in 2 different moments has its consequences, as we'll see next. In a panel object, the fixed part and the grid determine independent navigations, and each part will have its base table, as if there were 2 parallel for each commands. This creates an important difference with web panels. To determine the base table of the fixed part, the attributes that belong to the fixed part of the form, the attributes that belong to the events associated with the fixed part, as long as they're outside a for each command. In the refresh event, and events associated with buttons or controls of the fixed part, including those of the application bar, and also attributes of the tap conditions of the panel object will be taken into account. To determine the grid's base table, the attributes included in the grid columns, both visible and hidden, the attributes referenced in the grid order, search, advanced search, and conditions, and the attributes outside the for each clauses included in the load event and in the button or control events within the grid will be taken into account. Therefore, in the example we saw, as in the form, there are no attributes in the fixed part, only variables. There are no buttons either, as well as no attributes in the Conditions tab of the panel, and no attributes in the events associated with the variables. And in the refresh event, there are no attributes outside the for each, and the fixed part of the panel has no base table. In the grid, we have the attributes attraction ID, attraction name, country name, and attraction photo. So the base table will be attraction, because in the load event, the only attribute included is in the count formula. If you want to learn more about the topics addressed in this video, you can read the documentation about programming for native mobile devices, smart devices, since, as we said before, the panel object is also used in those applications. You can find more information in the wiki page displayed on screen.